Welcome to the Riddles and Secrets of History channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. To understand why the Vatican Archives evoke so much mystery and speculation today, one must go back many centuries to a time when not only the power of the Catholic Church was being born, but also the very idea of preserving and accumulating knowledge as a form of power. For in ancient times, knowledge was not for everyone. It was always the prerogative of the chosen. Imagine Rome at the end of the 1st century. The empire is torn between internal strife and external threats. But it is at this time that the Church begins to gain strength, becoming the new core that would replace the former imperial grandeur. The popes of Rome gradually become not only spiritual authorities but also political figures, on whose decisions the fates of states depended. And it was then that the need arose to preserve documents, treaties, charters, and letters from rulers who recognized the authority of Rome. The archives were not formed as a single room, but as a network of repositories where scribes and monks kept scrolls and books. In those days, the main treasure was not gold or artifacts, but the word written on parchment. This word could change a king's decision, determine the legitimacy of land ownership, or even become the basis for declaring war. Later, in the Middle Ages, the archives became a true center of power. Every letter that came from emperors or princes was proof of the Pope's power. Imagine a dark hall where scrolls, wrapped in red ribbons, lie on shelves, and each of them is a witness to events that chroniclers often forgot, but which were kept for the eyes of a few. Pope Leo III played a special role, actively corresponding with Charlemagne in the 8th century. These documents recorded not only politics but also the very fact of Charlemagne's coronation, which effectively restored the Western imperial tradition. These papers became the foundation for the idea of the Holy Roman Empire. Without the archives, we would know much less about this today. With each century, the archives grew. Popes ordered the collection of everything, from bulls and official decrees to personal letters in which kings asked for support. And here we see the most important feature: the archives were never just a repository. They were a weapon. The Pope could, at the right moment, pull out an ancient document and use it against a ruler or a bishop, proving his superiority. In the 12th century, under Pope Innocent III, the archives reached unprecedented development. It was then that Rome began to collect documents from all corners of Europe. Letters from England, France, Spain, and even from the distant Slavic lands found their place in the repositories. These documents gave the Pope a unique map of the world's political realities. One must imagine the atmosphere of the time. In the dark libraries of monasteries, in the narrow corridors of the Vatican, scribes bent over tables, noting every word. They knew that their work would not be for the public, but for the chosen few, those who held the levers of power. For ordinary people, these records were inaccessible. Even many cardinals did not have free access to them. But most interesting is the very idea of secrecy. While many medieval libraries, particularly at the universities of Bologna or Paris, were open to scholars, the Vatican created its archives specifically as a space of silence and secrecy. Why? Because secrecy enhances authority. When you possess knowledge unavailable to others, you become stronger. During the Renaissance, the archives became even more powerful. Popes like Sixtus IV and Leo X realized that their power rested not only on military strength or finances but also on control over history. If you control history, you shape the future. During this period, the archives began to be filled with manuscripts of ancient authors brought from different lands. Many of them were preserved precisely thanks to the Vatican, but at the same time, the archives became a place where unnecessary and dangerous documents were hidden. Records that could cast doubt on the authority of the papacy or cause scandals were sent to the repository. And here begins the real history of secrets, because some documents that could tell us more about alternative versions of the Gospels or the history of the first centuries of Christianity remained inaccessible. In the 17th century, Pope Paul V officially organized the archives into the form we know today. It was then that the structure known as the Vatican Secret Archives was created. The word secret in this context did not mean mystical or mysterious. It meant private. It was an archive that belonged only to the Pope and was his personal property. But for a world that had no access to these riches, this word became a symbol of mystery and inaccessibility. Since then, the Vatican Archives have become one of the most protected institutions in Europe. They contain millions of documents, over 80 kilometers of shelves, and hundreds of thousands of storage units. And all this is a history that could change our understanding of the past. But when we talk about the origin of the archives, we are not just talking about popes and scribes. We are talking about an idea that has survived centuries, the idea of power through knowledge. The Vatican Archives are not just a repository of papers. They are a symbol that the past can be a weapon, and silence can be the loudest scream. Medieval secrets. When we speak of the Middle Ages, we often imagine dark castles, inquisitors, crusaders, and magnificent cathedrals. But behind this facade of Gothic splendor hid another reality, a world of documents, letters, and bulls that had the power to turn the fates of states and people. And it is in the Vatican Archives that these witnesses to the events we call medieval secrets were kept. In those times, the Church was not only a spiritual institution, it was one of the main political players in Europe. Popes intervened in the conflicts of kings, decided issues of succession to thrones, and blessed or cursed rulers. All of this was accompanied by documents that had enormous legal force. Imagine how in the 12th century, letters from the kings of England or France arrived at the Vatican. They were written on parchment, adorned with seals, and every line was a testament to submission or, on the contrary, defiance. The archives preserved such documents, and it was they that allowed the Pope to control the situation. If a king promised tribute or recognized the authority of Rome, that document became a weapon. One of the greatest secrets of the medieval archives was the issue of coronations. No monarch in Europe could consider his power legitimate without the blessing of the Church. The archives preserved confirmation of these acts, charters, correspondence, and the terms of alliances. Without these papers, history could have been completely different. The period of the Crusades deserves special mention. The Vatican kept thousands of documents related to the organization of campaigns to the East. These letters described not only spiritual motives but also very specific financial agreements. Who would provide the army? What lands were promised for participation in the crusade? How would the spoils be divided? Imagine a document in which it is written in black and white that a certain baron will receive part of the conquered land in Palestine. This was political and economic planning, hidden under religious rhetoric. No less important is the history of the struggle between the popes and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. The conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV left behind entire volumes of correspondence. It is in these archives that one can find records of the famous walk to Canossa, when the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days to receive forgiveness. This event became a symbol of the power of the papacy over kings. And all of this has been preserved in the form of documents that now lie in the Vatican's repositories. The medieval archives also contained materials about heresies. Any new idea that deviated from official doctrine fell under suspicion, letters from bishops about dangerous preachers, testimonies of secret gatherings, even denunciations from peasants. All of this was meticulously recorded and preserved. This is where the practice of the Inquisition originated: first, gather information, then use it against the accused. Interestingly, some archival documents preserve not only official facts but also personal dramas. Imagine a village community in the 13th century writing to Rome with a complaint against their priest for abusing his power. Or a monk, suspected of witchcraft, writing a desperate letter asking for a pardon. These voices have long been silenced, but their echoes are hidden in the archives. A separate layer of medieval secrets is connected with knowledge. In those times, the Church had an almost complete monopoly on education. The archives preserved ancient texts, translations of Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates, but only a select few had access to them. For most people, knowledge remained locked away. Imagine how many generations did not know about these texts simply because they lay in locked repositories. Another interesting topic is documents about other religions. The Vatican closely monitored the development of Islam, the spread of Judaism in Europe, and the remnants of pagan beliefs. Reports from missionaries and intelligence about the customs of other peoples, all this formed a picture of the world that ordinary people never saw. The financial aspect is also worth mentioning. The archives contained information about the tithe, the mandatory taxes collected from the faithful. In these documents, one can trace how money flowed from remote villages into the rich treasuries of Rome. And these financial records were no less important than theological treatises because they showed the real, economic power of the Church. The Middle Ages were also a time of secret alliances and agreements. The Vatican often acted as a mediator between warring parties. The archives preserve charters on the conclusion of peace, the exchange of hostages, and marriage alliances, for example, documents about the marriage of French and English dynasties, which was intended to stop a war. These agreements determined the fate of nations, but their true terms remained known only to a few. And now let's try to imagine that all these documents have been preserved. They lie in special rooms, accessible only to select researchers. The medieval secrets have not disappeared, they are simply hidden behind the walls of the Vatican, and we know only what we are allowed to know. All this creates the feeling that the Vatican Archives are not just a library, but a time machine. It can transport us to the Middle Ages, show us the true faces of kings, popes, heretics, and ordinary people. But this machine works only for those who are allowed to look inside. That is why the medieval secrets of the archives still stir the imagination, because we understand that behind those thick walls lie the answers to questions that remain unanswered in our textbooks. Among all the riches of the Vatican Archives, one of the most interesting and, at the same time, mysterious layers is the correspondence between popes and monarchs. These are not just official documents or diplomatic pleasantries. They are living testimonies of how the history of Europe was shaped, how the fates of states and entire nations were decided. Behind each letter stood the emotions, fears, hopes, and ambitions of the people who ruled the world. Imagine a royal court in the 12th or 13th century. Servants prepare the parchment. A scribe writes out the address to the Holy See in golden letters. The king dictates the words, weighing each sentence. After all, not only politics but his own fate could depend on the tone of the letter. These letters traveled for weeks over mountains and seas and finally reached Rome. And there, in the quiet rooms of the Vatican, scribes preserved them in repositories that we now call the archives. One of the most striking examples of such correspondence is the history of the English kings. It is known that in the 13th century, Pope Innocent III actively intervened in the affairs of England. It was he who forced King John Lackland to submit and recognize England as a vassal of the Holy See. This fact is recorded in documents that are still kept in the Vatican. Imagine a monarch of a great state writing a letter in which he swears allegiance to the Pope, and that document becomes evidence for future generations. But the letters were not only about submission. Often, they had the character of a real diplomatic game. The kings of France, Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire tried to win the Pope over to their side in conflicts. These messages contained promises, threats, and even hidden insults, all written in exquisite language with impeccable addresses to the Most Holy Father. Special attention should be given to the letters concerning the Crusades. Monarchs appealed to the Pope for his blessing on their campaigns, to grant indulgences to their soldiers, and to secure the support of other states. In these documents, one can see how religious motives were intertwined with political ambitions. A king might write about liberating the Holy Sepulchre, but between the lines, one could feel the desire to gain new lands and riches. No less interesting is the correspondence with the monarchs of Eastern Europe. For example, the kings of Poland and Hungary actively corresponded with the Vatican, seeking support in their struggle against neighboring peoples. These letters also mention the lands of Rus, as it was a time of discussing the baptism of princes and possible alliances with Rome. For us, Ukrainians, these documents are extremely important. They show how the Vatican saw our lands and what place it assigned them in its plans. A true gem of the archives is the correspondence with the monarchs of Spain during the Age of Discovery. It was to the Vatican that reports of new lands, encounters with the Indians, and countless riches were sent. The Pope decided to whom the discovered territories belonged, Spain or Portugal. The famous Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the two states, also has its origins in these letters. And all of this is in documents that lie in the Vatican's repositories. But correspondence with monarchs is not only about major geopolitical decisions, it is also about very personal appeals. For example, kings often ask the Pope to bless their children or to confirm the legitimacy of a marriage or succession. Imagine a king writing a letter to Rome, begging for his son to be recognized as the heir to the throne. And the fate of a dynasty is decided not by the sword, but by the pen in the hands of the pontiff. There were also dramatic moments. The letters of the French King Philip IV, who entered into conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, are well known. This confrontation ended tragically. The Pope was humiliated and died shortly after the conflict. And it all began with an exchange of long letters, full of accusations and threats. These texts, preserved in the Vatican, show how words could become a weapon no less powerful than armies. Another striking example is the letters of Mary, Queen of Scots. In her correspondence, she appealed to the Pope for support in her struggle for the throne. These were the words of a woman who knew her life was hanging by a thread. And although her requests were not always heeded, these letters remain as a testament to how much monarchs relied on the support of the Vatican. If you think about it, the Vatican Archives are not only the history of the Church but also the history of Europe's monarchies. For without these letters, we would not know what rulers felt and thought in moments of greatest danger or greatest ambition. These were their confessions, though veiled in official style. And today, these documents remain the subject of major research, but access to them is limited. Only a small number of historians have the right to view them, and even they often see only what is permitted. This means that a significant part of this correspondence is still hidden. Perhaps it is there, in those closed volumes, that the answers to questions about the true motives of kings, about secret agreements, about betrayals lie. And it is this that makes the Vatican Archives such an attractive and, at the same time, unsettling place. Because behind every letter stands not only history but also a human soul that longed for power, love, or salvation. Thus, the correspondence with monarchs is a kind of mirror reflection of medieval and early modern Europe. These are not just documents. They are the living voices of kings that still sound through the centuries, hidden in the dark corridors of the Vatican. When we say the word Inquisition, images of dark chambers where candles burn and stern judges in robes interrogate people accused of heresy come to mind. But behind these dramatic pictures stood another, no less important reality: documents. Every trial, every accusation, every confession or verdict was meticulously recorded and found its place in the repositories. It is thanks to these documents that the Inquisition was able to exist for centuries, and they have become one of the most mysterious parts of the Vatican Archives. The first manifestations of the Inquisition appeared in the 12th century when the Church faced the spread of the Cathars in the south of France. This movement, which preached asceticism and denied many Catholic dogmas, was declared dangerous. The popes realized that this problem could not be solved by the sword, as ideas spread faster than troops could suppress uprisings. Then the idea arose to create special tribunals that would investigate, expose, and eradicate heresy. The archives of the Inquisition are not just dry records, they are the living, often tragic, stories of people. Imagine a peasant from a small French town appearing before the court and saying that he only repeated the words of a preacher who spoke of the purity and simplicity of faith. And now his words are entered into a protocol that is preserved for centuries. We would never have known about these people if it were not for the inquisitorial records. One of the most famous documents in the archives is the case file against the Knights Templar. At the beginning of the 14th century, the French King Philip IV the Fair, with the help of Pope Clement V, organized a trial against this powerful order. The Templars were accused of heresy, idol worship, and secret rituals. All the interrogations, confessions under torture, and even details of how the knights were forced to renounce their faith were carefully recorded. These documents remained secret for a long time and are now stored in the Vatican Archives. Historians who have had access to them claim that many of the accusations were fabricated, but the records remain as a testament to one of the greatest trials of the Middle Ages. Another important page is the case of Giordano Bruno. At the end of the 16th century, this thinker advocated ideas that went against official doctrine. He spoke of the infinity of the universe and the existence of other worlds. The Inquisition arrested him, interrogated him for several years, and demanded that he renounce his beliefs. All these interrogations were recorded in protocols. And although Bruno was eventually burned at the stake, his words remained in documents that now lie in the repositories. The archives of the Inquisition also contain a huge number of cases of ordinary people. These are not only philosophers or orders. They are also millions of ordinary Christians who were accused of witchcraft, of misinterpreting the Bible, of attending forbidden gatherings. Records have survived of how a peasant woman could be accused of conspiring with the devil just because she knew about herbs and healed the sick. In these protocols, you can read her words, her tears, her despair. These are voices that have come down to us through the centuries. A special place in the archives is occupied by documents about the witch trials. Although the most massive witch hunts took place in Northern Europe and were not always under the control of Rome, the Inquisition recorded testimonies in both Italy and Spain. Hundreds of records describe women's confessions of night flights, Sabbaths, and pacts with the devil. For us today, this sounds like fantasies under torture, but for a medieval person, it was a terrible reality. One cannot overlook the Spanish Inquisition, which played a special role. It created a gigantic bureaucratic machine where every interrogation, every denunciation was recorded with incredible pedantry. Thousands of volumes are stored in the Vatican Archives and are still inaccessible to the general public. They contain not only verdicts but also statistics and descriptions of property confiscated from the condemned. Thus, the Inquisition not only fought heresy but also replenished the treasury of the state and the Church. It is interesting that the Inquisition always worked in close connection with politics. Many trials were initiated not by the Church, but at the request of monarchs who needed to get rid of dangerous opponents. That is, the archives of the Inquisition are also evidence of political games in which religion was only a cover. But why do these documents remain so important and mysterious today? Because they show a different side of history. In official chronicles, we read about victories, the construction of temples, and holiness. But in the inquisitorial protocols, we see weakness, fear, and pain. This is the history of ordinary people who found themselves in a system where every word could be a death sentence. Modern historians who have worked with these documents say that they allow one to feel the true breath of the era. These are not abstract dates and facts, they are specific names, specific fates. And that is why the Vatican is so cautious about their disclosure. For in these papers lies not only the history of the Church but also its shadows. Thus, the archives of the Inquisition are one of the darkest but also one of the most valuable sources for our understanding of the Middle Ages. They preserve the memory of those who burned at the stake, who sat in dungeons, who held on to their truth until the very end. And as long as these documents lie behind closed doors, we can only guess how many more stories remain unknown. Imagine Italy at the beginning of the 17th century. The Renaissance had already given Europe masterpieces of art, new philosophy, and the rediscovery of the ancient world. But now came the age of science, which was to change the human view of the universe forever. One of the key figures of this era was Galileo Galilei, a man who managed to combine the talents of an observer, an engineer, and a thinker. His story is closely intertwined with the Vatican Archives, as they preserved the documents of the trial that became a symbol of the conflict between science and faith. Galileo was not only a scientist but also a passionate man. He believed in the power of experience and observation, while most of his contemporaries still clung to the authority of ancient texts. When he began to build telescopes and turn them to the sky, he discovered a world that contradicted the teachings of Aristotle and even the traditional interpretation of the Bible. He saw mountains on the moon, sunspots, and the phases of Venus, which could not be explained by the geocentric model of the universe. In his letters and treatises, Galileo supported Copernicus's idea of heliocentrism, that is, that the Earth revolves around the Sun. This was a revolutionary thought that undermined the established order of centuries. For if the Earth is not the center of the universe, then man no longer occupies the unique place that the Church attributed to him. We find the first records of the conflict between Galileo and the Church authorities precisely in the Vatican Archives. They contain the minutes of the meetings of the Holy Office, letters from cardinals discussing his works, as well as denunciations from his opponents. In these documents, we see that the problem was not only about science but also about politics. Galileo had patrons among the powerful families of Italy, and the Church feared that his authority might become too influential. In 1616, the Holy Office officially banned the teaching of Copernicus as erroneous and dangerous. The minutes state that Galileo was ordered not to teach or defend heliocentrism, but he did not stop. His nature was too restless. He believed in the power of experience and observation, not in fear. In 1632, he published his famous work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In the form of a conversation between three characters, he argued for the advantages of the heliocentric model. This book caused a storm. The Vatican perceived it as a direct challenge. In the archival documents, we read that the main accusation was that Galileo had violated the Order of 1616 and mixed faith with philosophy, misleading ordinary people. The trial of Galileo in 1633 became one of the most famous trials of the Inquisition. The protocols preserve every stage, from his summons to Rome to the final verdict. We can feel the atmosphere of this trial. Galileo, already elderly and ill, stands before stern judges who demand that he recant. He defends himself, trying to prove that his ideas do not contradict the Holy Scripture, but the pressure was too great. According to the documents, he eventually agreed to abjure, curse, and detest the heliocentric doctrine. The verdict sounded harsh: life imprisonment. In reality, he was placed under house arrest, where he spent the rest of his life. But this trial left a deep shadow on the relationship between science and the Church. Of particular value are Galileo's personal records, which are also stored in the Vatican's collections. These are his letters to his daughter, Sister Maria Celeste, who supported him during his most difficult moments. She wrote him words of comfort, and he responded, sharing his fears and, at the same time, his unwavering faith in the truth. In these letters, we see not only a scientist but also a man who suffered but did not lose his dignity. The archival documents also show a dual attitude towards him. On the one hand, he was condemned; on the other, he was not thrown into a dungeon but was allowed to continue his work at home. The Vatican understood that they were dealing not just with a heretic, but with a great mind whose value could not be denied. Interestingly, the archives contain evidence that even after the trial, Galileo continued to work on mechanics and optics, creating new instruments. His spirit was not broken, and it is this that makes his story so magnificent. Many centuries passed, and only in the 20th century did the Church officially admit its error in the Galileo affair. But the archival documents remain a priceless testimony to how the collision of two worlds, the world of faith and the world of science, occurred. These records are also important because they show the human dimension of history. These are not just protocols and orders, they are cries of the soul. This is the struggle between fear and the pursuit of truth. And that is why the case of Galileo has become a symbol for all subsequent generations of scientists who have felt the pressure of power but have continued to search for answers. Thus, the Vatican Archives, which preserve the documents of the trial of Galileo, are not just a memory of one trial. They are a memory of the eternal struggle of man for the right to know, to see, and to discover the world as it is. And perhaps it is in these archives that hundreds of other stories of scientists who once risked everything for the sake of truth are hidden. At the beginning of the 16th century, Europe was experiencing a time of great upheaval. The knightly orders were losing their former glory, kings were strengthening their power, and ordinary people were increasingly questioning the authority of the Church. And it was then that an event began that changed not only the course of European history but the entire world, the Reformation. At the center of this movement were not only sermons and ideas but also letters and documents preserved in the Vatican Archives. These are the secret letters, witnesses of an era when the word became more dangerous than the sword. It all began in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. In them, he openly spoke out against indulgences, the practice that allowed the purchase of forgiveness for sins. His text quickly spread throughout Europe thanks to the printing press. But few know that just a few months after this event, the first secret letters from bishops and nuncios appeared in the Vatican, reporting on the dangerous ideas spreading among the people. These letters, filled with anxiety, are the first evidence of how Rome reacted to the beginning of the Reformation. Imagine the atmosphere of these letters. A bishop writes to Rome, people are gathering in the squares, reading and discussing Luther's theses. They are asking questions to which we have no answers. They are no longer afraid. These lines conveyed the fear of a new force that was being born among ordinary believers. A special place in the archives is occupied by the correspondence of Pope Leo X. At first, he tried to downplay Luther's importance, calling him a drunken German who would soon sober up. But the documents show how quickly the tone changed. In subsequent letters to his legates, the Pope demanded decisive action and preparation for an official condemnation. In 1520, the bull Ex Surge Domini excommunicated Luther from the Church. And this document, adorned with a seal, now lies among the Vatican's manuscripts. But the most interesting are not the official bulls, but the secret letters. They reveal the true atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Legates wrote from Germany that even princes were beginning to support Luther, and universities were openly discussing his ideas. One such letter contains the words, "If we do not stop him, all of Germany may fall into apostasy." In these documents, we see not only official condemnation but also the behind-the-scenes struggle. Papal envoys tried to persuade German princes to remain loyal to Rome, offering political and financial concessions. Some of these negotiations took place secretly, and their details still lie in the archives under the inaccessible classification. Interestingly, among these letters are also reports on the reaction of ordinary people. One of the nuncios wrote that peasants had begun to quote scripture, proving their case to priests. This was unheard of. The Bible, which for centuries had been held only by educated theologians, was now becoming the book of the people. And it was this that frightened Rome the most. The Reformation spread rapidly, and the secret letters multiplied. They testified to the growing danger. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli was speaking out. In France, followers of Luther appeared. In Geneva, John Calvin was rising. In every letter, there is anxiety, sometimes even despair. The cardinals in Rome understood that they were facing not just a heresy, but a new era. The letters concerning the German Peasants' War of 1524–25 are of particular interest in the archives. Although Luther himself distanced himself from the rebellion, many insurgents justified their actions with his ideas. Reports reached the Vatican about peasants who had risen up with the Bible in their hands. For Rome, this was a terrifying signal. The Reformation had moved beyond theological disputes and turned into a social explosion. These secret letters also preserved the stories of individuals who tried to find a compromise. Some bishops wrote to the Pope that harsh persecution would only deepen the schism, proposing to seek dialogue. But most responses from Rome were firm: heresy must be eradicated. The letters related to England are also worth mentioning. When King Henry VIII, in the 1530s, wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, he appealed to the Pope for permission. But the Vatican refused. The archives hold letters in which cardinals warned that a refusal could lead to England's separation from Rome. And so it happened. Henry created his own church. These documents are witnesses to the birth of Anglicanism, which forever changed the face of Britain. The secret letters from the time of the Reformation also reflect the Catholic Church's attempts to respond to the challenges. In 1545, the Council of Trent began, which became the basis of the Counter-Reformation. The Vatican holds letters from this council where new dogmas, disciplinary measures, and even art and education were discussed. It was an attempt to strengthen the authority of the Church and to resist the wave of Protestantism. But what is most striking is that all these documents have been preserved. Imagine how, in the dark halls of the archives, lie yellowed letters, written 5 centuries ago, that convey the emotions of that turbulent era. These are the voices of bishops, princes, kings, and ordinary believers. They tell of fear and hope, of betrayal and faith, of the struggle for the future of Europe. The Reformation changed the map of the world. It led to the creation of new churches, new states, and new ideas. But at the very heart of this story remained the secret letters, documents that show how a new era was born. And today they lie in the Vatican Archives, reminding us that history is not only about great battles but also about the words written by the hand of a person who believed in their truth. Secret knowledge of other religions. The Vatican Archives are often imagined as a repository of papal bulls, correspondence with monarchs, and the protocols of Inquisition trials. But in their depths, there is another special category of documents, records concerning other religions. From the first centuries of Christianity, the Church closely monitored the beliefs of its neighbors, rivals, and even enemies. These were not just theological studies, this was strategic information that helped to build policy, influence peoples, and maintain power. Imagine a medieval missionary setting out for distant lands. He observes, listens, and writes. His notes on customs, beliefs, and rituals then end up in Rome. There, scribes carefully preserve them in special volumes. For the missionary, it was a life's work. For the Church, it was the key to understanding and controlling foreign cultures. One of the first objects of attention was Judaism. Christianity grew out of the Jewish tradition, and therefore the Church always kept an eye on the life of Jewish communities. The archives hold letters and reports about the life of Jews in medieval Europe. There are mentions of their customs, the celebration of Passover, and the peculiarities of their rituals, but alongside this, there are also denunciations of Jewish conspiracies or blasphemies. These documents show a dual attitude: on the one hand, curiosity and an attempt to understand, and on the other, fear and hostility. An equally significant part of the archives is dedicated to Islam. From the 7th century, when Muslims began to conquer new lands, Europe felt threatened. Popes received reports from diplomats, merchants, and missionaries describing Muslim society, its laws, faith, and military strength. These documents preserved descriptions of mosques, quotes from the Quran, and even stories about the customs of Arab rulers. The reports from the time of the Crusades became particularly valuable for historians. They convey not only descriptions of battles but also the daily life of Muslims, their education system, trade, and culture. The archives also preserve unique documents about contacts with the Byzantine Empire and Orthodoxy. Although Christianity remained a common foundation, after the Great Schism of the 11th century, Rome and Constantinople went their separate ways. In the Vatican Archives lie letters discussing the theological difference of the Filioque and the Creed, stories about disputes over rituals, as well as diplomatic attempts at reconciliation. These are not just theological texts, but testimonies of how two branches of Christianity tried to find a common language but drifted further and further apart. A special layer consists of documents concerning the pagan beliefs of Europe. The medieval reports of missionaries preserve details about the rituals of the Germanic peoples, Celts, and Slavs. For example, in the records of bishops, one can find descriptions of solstice celebrations, the worship of trees or springs, and sacrifices. These documents are valuable because many pagan traditions did not leave their own written evidence. Thanks to the archives, we know how the Christianization of Europe took place and how ancient beliefs were gradually supplanted. For Ukrainians, the reports about the Slavic lands are particularly interesting. The Vatican holds letters from missionaries who described our ancient rituals, the veneration of Purim, Kupala festivals, and the belief in household spirits and mermaids. Although these descriptions were often biased and aimed to show the darkness of the pagans, today they are a priceless source of knowledge about the spiritual world of our ancestors. One cannot overlook the documents about Asia. When Christian missions set out for Mongolia and China in the 13th century, their reports also ended up in the Vatican. The archives contain letters from Franciscans who described the Khan's court, his customs, and also mentioned Buddhism and Confucianism. These texts became Europe's first window into the world of the Far East. In the 16th century, when the age of great geographical discoveries began, the Vatican received reports about the religions of the New World. Missionaries described the beliefs of the Incas, Mayas, and Aztecs. The letters spoke of their gods, temples, and rituals of human sacrifice. The Church saw in this both